Tanche Kiwao, Brodie Douglas Dashnakashan. Thank you very much for joining me today on this presentation. I hope to share a little bit about our Métis story with you, and that story is the Métis experience within British Columbia. The traditional territory of the Métis Nation was an expansive, shared territory stretching from Ontario across the prairies into British Columbia. It includes the northern United States of America and the southern Northwest Territories. The Métis were the most powerful military presence in the Northwest between 1816 and 1885. This power was solidified through relationships and alliances between other Indigenous people. In 1811, the Hudson's Bay Company granted Thomas Douglas, the Earl of Selkirk, land within the Red River as a place to settle displaced Scots being impacted by the Scottish land clearances. However, the influx of settlers disturbed the traditional lifestyle of the Métis, specifically our harvesting and our commercial practices. Within 5 years of their arrival in 1816, armed conflict erupted between Selkirk's colonists and the Métis, who were then under the leadership of Cuthbert Grant Jr. This battle has become known as the Battle of Seven Oaks, or the Battle of Frog Plain, and it was the first time that our national flag, the first Indigenous flag to Canada, was flown.
Comme des braves guerriers, arrivant à la grenouillère, avons pris trois prisonniers des
This flag is still the iconic flag of the Métis Nation, and Falcon Song is still being sung across our homeland. This is evidence of the fact that by the early 19th century, Métis recognized ourselves as having a distinct national consciousness with a collective national narrative. After the events of 1816, the British government ordered an inquiry into the causes of the conflict. What resulted is known as the Coltman Report, and in short it recommended that the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company merge. Following the merger of the two fur trade companies in 1821, Métis and Red River developed a mixed economy beyond the fur trade. Both English and French Métis developed a common land tenure system, allowing for long, narrow river lots. We expanded our traditional buffalo economy to a mixed economy of farming, harvesting, and mercantile operations. In addition to farming and buffalo hunting, Métis also continued the tradition of contracting our labor to the fur trade. It is estimated that in the 1830s, 20% of the Hudson's Bay Company contract employees were Métis, and by the 1850s, that number had increased to 50%. Additionally, Métis provided seasonal labor transporting goods, either by cart or boat, between the fur trade posts. The economy of Red River generated wealth for our people. However, the buffalo began to decline in Red River during the 1850s, and it was certainly apparent by the 1860s that the Métis could no longer rely on the buffalo to support and provide for us. Shortly after Canadian Confederation, the federal government made an effort to acquire land that was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, and in 1869 successfully acquired Rupert's land from the HBC. At that time, it has been suggested that Métis constituted 85% of the total population of Red River settlement, which was estimated to be 11,400 people in total. In addition, two key events occurred within Red River in 1869 that contributed to a growing sense of Métis nationalism. The first event was the formation of the first Métis Nation provisional government under President John Bruce and then Louis Riel, and the second event was the actions and subsequent execution of Ontario surveyor and orangeman Thomas Scott by Riel's provisional government. Despite negotiating the Manitoba Act of 1870, Louis Riel was exiled to the United States of America, where he remained until 1884. Furthermore, after Manitoba joined Confederation, federal troops were dispatched to the Red River under the command of Colonel Garnet Wolseley, with the intention of establishing Canadian sovereignty. The actions of the federal troops created an atmosphere amongst the Métis of Red River that many historians have described as a reign of terror, and it resulted in an exodus of Métis to Saskatchewan and into the northern United States. In the early 1870s, Métis in Saskatchewan began petitioning the federal government for recognition of our Métis rights. However, the federal government did not take action until 1879, when they amended the Dominion Lands Act. Now, this amendment had little effect on addressing Métis grievances. In fact, it exacerbated them. In 1884, under the leadership of Gabriel Dumont, the Métis again enlisted the services of Louis Riel, who was by then an American citizen and teaching in Montana, to assist them with our efforts in obtaining recognition for our Métis rights. Together, Riel and Dumont organized a second Métis Nation provisional government, and in 1885 the Métis successfully engaged Canadian federal forces at the Battle of Duck Lake and at the Battle of Fish Creek. Despite the initial victories of the Métis, the Canadian government was able to quash the Métis at the Battle of Batoche. This was the final military engagement between Métis and Canadian forces. Following the Battle of Batoche, the Métis were again driven westward. This time our people moved in greater numbers to northern Alberta and into the Peace River district of British Columbia. Many Métis went south to the United States and some returned to the Red River. Through military and political conquests and resulting demographic shifts, collective Métis land rights were ignored by successive government, and a regime of non-recognition by the Canadian and provincial state was implemented. It is important to remember that following the events of 1885 and the murder of President Riel by Canada, it was not advantageous to be identified as Métis. Ce n'est pas beau d'être Métis. Credit for the fur trade interest in the Pacific slopes must be given to Sir Alexander Mackenzie of the Northwest Company, whose explorations in and subsequent publication of his journey to the Pacific drew the attention of American and Montreal interests, and further prioritized the need for access into the fur territory of the Pacific Northwest. The fur trade on the western slopes of the Pacific generally begins with the narrative of two eastern fur enterprises and concludes with one transnational corporation. The Pacific Fur Company, founded by New York financier J.J. Astor, was the first company to successfully commercialize the Pacific and the interior of BC, whereas Montreal's Northwest Company successfully penetrated the Rockies and the Peace River into the Athabasca-Columbia regions. Under the Hudson's Bay Company's governor, George Simpson, the infrastructure for successive governments was cemented and the mechanisms of economic and social control were institutionalized. These two major fur companies opened the corridors of communication into what would become British Columbia. More often than not, the relationship between these two corporate bodies remained amicable, yet fiercely competitive. In 1813, the Pacific Fur Company was purchased by the Northwest Company, and the logistics of intercontinental trade were implemented for the first time. Following the purchase, the Northwest Company geographically controlled what would become British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon, from the Mackenzie Drainage Basin to the mouth of the Columbia. As aforementioned, in 1821, the Northwest Company and the Hudson's Bay Company merged. This resulted in the Hudson's Bay Company reorganizing existing infrastructure to operate on an economically efficient manner. This was formalized shortly after the amalgamation in 1824, and again during the 1840s prior to the Oregon Settlement of 1846. Ironically, earlier trade routes established by the Northwest Company gained greater significance, and new routes were established to support an all-British route to the Pacific. In 1858, when the gold rush began in earnest along the Fraser River, communication corridors existed from Victoria through to Fort St. John. Because many of the Métis fur trade employees who came to BC with the early explorers remained on the Pacific slopes, their social status and influence within the corporate structure of the Hudson's Bay Company became another feature of socio-cultural distinction. Indeed, although the Métis community of the Pacific Northwest initially opposed mass settlement, it was through their influence that British Columbia transitioned from a corporate territory to a settlement capable of governing the wave of immigration brought on by the gold rush. Within 5 of the leading Métis families of the Pacific Northwest, there are 4 connections to David Thompson. For example, the following fur traders arrived with Thompson and remained on the Pacific slopes: Pierre Bercier, Nicholas Montour Jr., Jocko Finlay, and Finan MacDonald. Pierre Bercier married Emily Finlay, the granddaughter of Jocko Finlay. Nicholas Montour married Suzanne Umperville, and their daughter married Thomas McKay. Finan MacDonald's granddaughter married the Métis grandson of Margaret McLaughlin. As a matter of interest, according to the supplementary report of the Public Schools of British Columbia in 1872, there were 182 of school age and 51 under school age half-breeds accounted for in this province, opposed to the non-Aboriginal children, 105 school-aged and 61 under school age. Recent analysis of the fur trade biographies west of the Rockies by historian Cassandra White and Mike Evans have resulted in some interesting data regarding Métis presence west of the Divide. For example, while 11% of fur traders, excluding maritime personnel, were identified as mixed Aboriginal, 23% of spouses of fur traders were identified as mixed Aboriginal. Furthermore, 75% of children born of the fur trade were identified as mixed Aboriginal. Now, of those identified as mixed Aboriginal, 7.5% were born in the Columbia District, 13% were born in New Caledonia, 16% were born in Red River, and 19% were born in Rupert's Land. Whereas of those identified as mixed Aboriginals, 21% died in the Columbia District, 20% died in New Caledonia, 9% died in Victoria, and 4% died in the Willamette Valley. Now, that's not to dwell on the death rates, but to say that we didn't go anywhere and we stayed within the Pacific Northwest. So Métis were on the Pacific Slope well before the exertion of government control around 1858. We were also recognized by the federal government as having a rights-bearing community in the Fort St. John area, evidenced by the fact that the area was included in the Half-Breed Claims Commission associated with Treaty 8. Métis and BC were both connected to historic Métis families and also to the mixed Aboriginal communities that developed in British Columbia during the colonial era. Métis built our influence in this province to a point where we were in positions of political power. However, European newcomers and their discriminatory attitudes, in addition to a hostile legal regime in BC, forced the Métis underground, but it did not extinguish our culture, history, or distinct social structures. We can look at fur trade routes within the province of BC to identify the historic highways used by the Métis. This is valuable because it shows where the Métis were historically, and by contrast where the Métis were not. The Métis networks of communication operated both formally and informally between BC and the Métis homeland, and they are clearly evident when one considers the transportation routes used in the fur trade. For example, Métis accompanied such early fur traders as Sir Alex Mackenzie, Simon Fraser, and David Thompson, amongst others, into BC during the late 1790s and early 1810s. Brigade and express routes conveyed people, goods, and ideas between the Pacific and the prairies. As the children of the fur trade, Métis communities did not emerge in the absence of the fur trade. I must reinforce the fact that the two primary points of entry into BC was via either Dunvegan, Alberta, or through Jasper House, Alberta. I stress this point to illustrate that the Métis in BC are not disconnected from the Métis in Alberta and east across the homeland. It's also interesting to note that the communication routes east of the Rocky Mountains were primarily in an east to west direction, whereas west of the Continental Divide in British Columbia, communication was generally in a north to south direction. The second wave of Métis advancement occurred during the 1858 gold rush and continued during the Klondike gold rush years. Although the historical record is quiet on why Métis chose to enter BC, the evidence suggests that Métis settlement during this period focused on the Peace River region and within the Kootenay-Columbia district. In fact, as aforementioned, it was the influence of Métis on First Nations within the Peace River and Athabasca districts that prompted the federal government to negotiate Treaty 8 and include the Métis within the Northwest Half-Breed Claims Commission. Curiously enough, most of the scrip applications made by BC Métis residents to Treaty 8 show the residential location of Métis being in the Kootenay-Columbia district and not within the Peace River district. In addition to scrip applications and fur trade records, how can we be certain that the Métis were in BC? Well, we can be certain that we were here based on the writings and publications of Paul Kane and David Douglas. Both writers documented Métis west of the Rockies. For example, Paul Kane's boat encampment visualizes the location used by David Thompson in 1811 before he traveled down the Columbia. In 1838, Fathers Blanchet and Demare baptized 35 Métis children from 16 families living at Jasper House. It is interesting to state that among the 35 Métis children, I have identified at least 3 that are third-generation Métis. In 1841, Father Pierre de Smet noted the presence of Métis within the Kootenay-Columbia territory, and in fact the Métis that de Smet baptized were connected genealogically to the Métis at Jasper House and the Métis within the Columbia district in what would become Montana. Not only were Métis recognized by travel writers and Roman Catholic priests, we were also identified by First Nations as having territory within BC. The Shuswap were documented as active fur trappers within the central interior of BC, extending through the Kootenay-Columbia district into the Jasper House community. In fact, Baptiste Morageau, a Métis from the Kootenay-Columbia district, married first into the Kinbasket band and later into the Tanaha band. According to a 2008 traditional land use study, Shuswap elders stated that the Shuswap were encouraged to trade at Rocky Mountain House, although due to the attacks by the Métis, they preferred to trade at the fort at Kamloops. According to ethnologist James Alexander Tate, Métis occupied territory around Tijon Cache, extending into the Jasper House, Alberta area. As Tate notes, the information about the Métis was collected from Shuswap elders who were familiar with Shuswap history. Now, it is extremely significant that Tate ascribed the name Le Michif to the Métis, because the Michif language of the Métis was not studied or spoken outside of the Métis community until the 1960s. In other words, the Métis self-identified as Le Michif, and it is this type of connection to the historic homeland that has often been overlooked by BC Métis researchers. Another important feature about this map is that it clearly states that the Shuswap recognized Métis as having traditional territory. For example, Tate notes that the Métis territory was acknowledged to have one time been exclusively occupied by Métis, and including the word temporarily suggests that the Métis were in a position to eventually reassert control over the territory. It is always worth remembering that the term Métis was never universally adopted amongst our people. In this case, the community was not recorded in the historic record as Métis or even a half-breed community. The community was identified as a mixed Aboriginal community with Iroquois lineage. They traded flower beadwork and spoke not Iroquois, but Cree French. Furthermore, they self-identified to their neighbors as Le Michif. In addition to Church and First Nations recognition, Métis were recognized by the federal government as occupying land within the Mackenzie and the Peace River districts of British Columbia. The Klondike Gold Rush was the impetus for the federal government to negotiate with First Nations and Métis in the region covered by Treaty 8. The Half-Breed Commission was instructed, and I quote, not to accord more liberal terms than were accorded to the half-breeds of Manitoba and the Organized Territories. So this is further indication that the Métis in BC were acknowledged to be connected to our historic homeland. Public notice in the Canada Gazette was issued in June of 1898, indicating the federal government's intention of treating with the Indians and half-breeds of the Provisional District of Athabasca and such territory immediately adjacent thereto. And I quote, "It is deemed advisable to include within the said treaty the extinguishment of their title to the lands." Now, according to the public notice, the federal government committed to being at Fort St. John on the 21st of June, 1899. However, I could find no evidence of the Half-Breed Commission ever having met with the Métis at Fort St. John. In fact, for the regions included within BC, the federal government was unable to provide an estimate to the total number of Métis. Furthermore, according to internal estimates, the federal government did not provide food rations of tea and bacon for points within BC. This is evidence that suggests there was no effort by the federal government to identify how many Métis were in the Mackenzie and Peace River districts. The Métis Nation did not sign treaties with the federal government. This is in contrast with the federal government's treatment with First Nations. Instead, eligible Métis were entitled to apply for half-breed scrip, which was an entitlement to receive either land or cash in exchange for surrendering their Indian title to the land. Not all mixed Aboriginal communities are connected to the historic Métis Nation. Several communities in BC, notably along the Fraser River, developed mixed Aboriginal communities following the fur trade and gold rush eras. These communities are not historically connected to the Métis buffalo hunters of the historic Northwest. Métis are, to borrow a term from Antoine Lucier and Bruce Seeley, the other natives in Canada. Understanding of who the Métis are is not always a simple objective or an easy task. Researching Métis identification can lead to more questions rather than solid understanding. For example, and broadly speaking, there are two acceptable views of Métis identification within Canada. On the one hand is anyone with mixed Aboriginal ancestry can self-identify as Métis. In other words, the Métis comes from the fact that the individual has identified an Indigenous ancestor within their family lineage, and is therefore Métis because of that mixed Indigenous and non-Indigenous ancestry. Possibly their Métis identity was documented after colonization, but pre-effective government control. This definition includes non-status First Nations and has been successfully argued at the Supreme Court of Canada in 2003. On the other hand, is the Métis National Council's national definition of Métis, established in 2002, which defines Métis as a person who self-identifies as Métis, is distinct from other Aboriginal people, is of historic Métis Nation ancestry, and who is accepted by the Métis Nation. The Métis National Council represents Métis federally and internationally, and is made up of elected representatives from across the Métis homeland. Métis Nation British Columbia has this definition enshrined as Article 61 of their Constitution Act, meaning that MNBC can only register Métis who meet that national definition. Métis Nation British Columbia is the provincial body representing Métis within the province of BC. MNBC issues citizenship cards to applicants who meet the requirements of the national definition. Other Aboriginal peoples screened against the federal Indian band list show how they are genealogically connected to an historically identified Métis ancestor through a family tree, supported by baptismal records or birth certificates, and are accepted by the Métis Nation by demonstrating that they have been accepted by their local chartered community. Chartered communities are the political bodies that represent Métis at the local level. There are 38 Métis chartered communities in BC. Some of the chartered communities issue membership cards, and others simply maintain a membership list. Indeed, the chartered communities have their own membership criteria separate from that of Métis Nation British Columbia. Some communities require an annual membership fee, regular attendance to their meetings, completed family genealogy, a recommendation from MNBC's Central Registry, or a combination of the above. Chartered community membership requirements are not consistent across the province, and some members of chartered communities are not eligible for Métis citizenship. The Métis Nation is made up of the descendants of the historic Métis buffalo hunters of the Northwest, often described in the historic record as half-breeds or bois brûlés. Again, the traditional territory of the historic homeland of the Métis Nation stretches from Western Ontario across the three prairie provinces into the northern United States and the southern Northwest Territories, also into northeastern British Columbia. The cultural and political center of this people is the Red River. As Jean Taillé, a Métis lawyer and great-grandniece of Louis Riel, notes, it is easy to recognize Métis individuals within the historic record, such as Louis Riel, Gabriel Dumont, Maria Campbell, and Suzette Chalafou Swift. However, it has always been difficult to identify the Métis collective. There are several factors Taillé notes that contribute to this difficulty. So please allow me to paraphrase from Taillé. Historically, there were only two legal identity options available in Canada, either white or Indian. And as we have seen, Métis people were often represented in both groups, the inference being that no one wants to recognize the existence of a mixed race people. Métis territorial claims were dismantled through scrip, and a government policy of non-recognition of the geographic boundaries of the Métis Nation was implemented. The Michif language, or national Métis language, was not spoken outside of the Métis community until the 1960s. This meant that the distinct language of the Métis was not known or studied outside of the Métis community. Métis do not have a distinct phenotype, or put another way, there is no Métis look. Finally, it's not safe to identify as Métis following the events of 1870 and 1885, and especially given that Métis are a highly mobile people, which makes tracing our communities, and perhaps more relevant, tracing the community belonging, very difficult. So it is hoped that this presentation has demonstrated evidence that, unlike other mixed Aboriginals, BC Métis can identify expressions of Métis nationalism within our collective history. Marsii, thank you very much.